Last week, Parliament adopted the agreement that had been signed between the government of Sri Lanka and the International Monetary Fund. Parliament approved of it. In support of that, the government received 120 votes, which was only 7 votes over and above the number of votes required for a simple majority. That is 113 votes. So they just received 7 votes more than that. Now, there is certainly no legal requirement that this agreement should be submitted to Parliament for approval. That is not a legal requirement. It is also contrary to previous practice and tradition. But there was a reason why the government adopted this measure. They were well aware that the implementation of this agreement would be exceedingly unpopular. There would be strong resistance from the people because of certain conditions that are contained in this agreement. Therefore, the government was reluctant to accept sole responsibility for this agreement and was very keen to share a part of that responsibility with Parliament. Now, the question is not whether one should have gone to the IMF or not. In those circumstances, it was inevitable. The issue is not that. The issue is how those negotiations were conducted. That is where the basic fault lies. Our criticism of the manner in which these negotiations were carried on between the government of Sri Lanka, its representatives, and the IMF, is that the priorities of Sri Lanka, the nuances of local situations, were not adequately placed before the International Monetary Fund. This is not how other countries have conducted successful negotiations with the IMF. There was always a very sharp focus on what the country actually required. But that was never done in this case. That is because of a pervasive fear on the part of the government that the entire exercise would fall through if with some degree of tenacity and commitment the Sri Lanka government through its representatives put forward in a vigorous way Sri Lanka's own special requirements. Consequently, there was a tendency to agree to everything that was proposed from the other side. And inevitably, the result of it was that Sri Lanka did not obtain an agreement that best suited the interests of our people. Now, this is manifest from some of the aspects of this agreement and the sequel to which those provisions in the agreement gave rise. Now, the question of enhancing state revenue, of course that is necessary, but it has to be done in a manner that is palatable to our people. There is a limit to the physical capacity to endure anguish and pain. Our people have to bear the brunt of the increase of taxation. Now, can they physically bear this? During the next 4 months, the yield from taxation will go up 119%. So that is more than twice the amount that is collected today from taxes that are levied on the people of our country. Now, from today, the concession that was given in respect of customs levies for wheat flour has been abolished. That has been done away with. We already have a very serious problem with regard to malnutrition. 1/3 of the children in our country are suffering from malnutrition. The World Bank has officially declared that poverty is doubling in Sri Lanka. Then the result of this agreement is that Sri Lanka loses any authority to make decisions with regard to the interest rates, whether they are to be increased or decreased as circumstances require from time to time. That can only be done with the approval of the International Monetary Fund. Now, this is a matter which impacts directly on the daily lives of our people. It can result in the closure of factories, the loss of livelihoods on a very significant scale. especially in the small and medium sector. So all of this is going to impose untold hardships on our people. So has there been sufficient sensitivity about this? Was the IMF told, yes, there are things that need to be done, there must be fiscal discipline, but at the same time we have to bear in mind how much our people can endure. We do not believe that this was sufficiently addressed in the negotiations that were carried on with the International Monetary Fund. At the end of the day, there is almost no role today in the preparation of this year's budget, which has to be presented to Parliament in November this year. There is only a very negligible role for the Treasury and the Central Bank. There are provisions in the agreement that daily and weekly reports have to be submitted to the IMF. They must approve those reports. So we do not think for a moment that that is a state of affairs that is at all compatible with the independence and the stature of a country like ours. In light of these circumstances, I want to emphasize that there has to be renegotiation of some parts of this agreement. A future government is duty bound to suggest certain modifications and amendments. They must re-engage with the International Monetary Fund. Up to now, there has not been a genuine engagement. Now, that engagement must take place after a new government assumes office. And the fact that Parliament has approved this agreement is in no way an obstacle. It is not an impediment to the revision of some aspects of this agreement. A future government, as the representatives of the people of our country, has every right and indeed a paramount duty to suggest amendments that they consider to be essential or beneficial, and that will certainly be done. Now, when that task is taken in hand, the priority, the main focus will be with regard to the restructuring of the domestic debt, which is the most complex part of this exercise, and which is the area where our people are going to suffer the most horrendous consequences. Now, government was well aware of this, and that is why they made a persistent effort to deny that the overall restructuring exercise would include the restructuring of domestic debt. They were in denial mode, total denial mode. Both the governor of the central bank and the state ministers of finance were at pains to insist that they would not touch the domestic debt. We knew all along that that was not the case, but now government has been compelled to admit that what they said earlier is not correct, and indeed the restructuring of the domestic debt is an integral and essential part of the overall exercise. Not only that, they have said that the entire exercise will begin with the restructuring of the domestic debt. And they have further stated that a comprehensive plan in respect of this will be prepared and submitted to the International Monetary Fund before the end of this month, before the end of May. This is undoubtedly going to have a deleterious impact on the stability of the local banking system that cannot be avoided. Now, the Sri Lanka Banks Association have said as much in appropriate terms. They have pointed out that government is speaking of a certain part of this exercise being voluntary. So naturally they want to know what is the distinction, which part is voluntary, which part is involuntary. What about the involuntary part? Will they be compelled to take decisions which are not in the interest of the stability of the Sri Lankan banking system? These are all opaque areas, very grey areas in respect of which there is no clarity even at the basic level. That cannot continue. The government must come clean. They can't hide things. They can't sweep this under the carpet. So they have to be candid and state unequivocally, honestly, what they propose to do. It is no good adopting an arrogant attitude and proclaiming that if the local bank slows down, that is not a problem. And that it makes very little difference whether the stock exchange is open or closed. Those insensitive, authoritarian approaches do no good at all. They've done considerable harm. Nestlé's, an internationally known and respected company which has had operations in this country for several decades, has now pulled out of the stock market. That is not surprising. When the head of state tells parliament that he is indifferent to the closure of the stock exchange if it becomes necessary. Now, as far as we are concerned, the most critical part of this problem has to do with the employees' provident fund. We are very focused on that for the compelling reason that the employees' provident fund contains money belonging to the workers of this country. These are the resources on which they hope to live after retirement. Now, 90% of the resources in the employees' provident fund are invested in treasury bills. Now, government has said that they will start the domestic restructuring process with the treasury bills. So, you have 90% of EPF funds in the treasury bills, and the government is saying that they are going to start by restructuring the treasury bills. Cause and effect. However the government tries to camouflage this, the inevitable effect of that will be a considerable reduction of the money value of the resources that are contained in the employees' provident fund. Working people are going to lose money. Government is using all kinds of fancy terms, optimization, restructuring, but there is a smoke screen. Under that is the unpalatable reality that huge losses, billions of rupees, that loss will be sustained by the working people of our country at a time of their lives, the evening of their lives, when they can least afford to take such a major financial hit. Now, as far as we are concerned, we will do everything in our power to prevent the government from diminishing the value of the EPF by resorting to various stratagems as part of the overall exercise of restructuring the domestic debt. What is involved here is not just a moral or ethical issue, but indeed a legal issue of very considerable importance. See, the managers of the EPF are trustees. They are not the owners. The owners are the working people. Now, the trustees have a duty, a fiduciary duty, to invest and utilize these resources in such a manner as to confer the maximum benefit on the owners. They cannot be party to any decision or any course of action which has the result of reducing the money in the provident fund to the detriment of the beneficial owners, the working population of this country. So not only will we resist this with all the vigor at our disposal at the political level, but in addition to that, we will contemplate legal action before the courts of our country to prevent the government from laying their hands on the EPF in such a manner as to cause loss to the working people of our country. We are already in consultation with our lawyers, and if necessary, we will take legal measures, legal initiatives to protect the vital interests of trade unions and workers in our country. There's also a significant issue with regard to the scale of fraud, corruption, pillage and plunder. Pillage and plunder in our country. The International Monetary Fund states very clearly in their report that corruption is one of the main impediments with regard to economic recovery in our country. But paying lip service to that is not sufficient. We want to say candidly that we are not at all satisfied with the practical measures which the IMF has taken to control the incidence of corruption in our country. They have to do very much more, because the resources that they are placing at our disposal, approximately 2.9 billion US dollars over a period of 48 months, is not a gift. We have to pay it back. We have to pay the interest and the capital. And the IMF is also under a duty to ensure that the benefit of this accrues to the people of our country and it is not siphoned off into corruption. Now, government has undertaken to reduce corruption, but we don't see any evidence of any genuine desire on the part of the government to fulfill this promise. Now, there is much talk, it is headlines in some newspapers today, that a new institution is to be set up. That is a parliamentary budget office consisting of 2 officers appointed by the president. The professed objective of this parliamentary budget office is to ensure that monies voted by parliament for public purposes are not misapplied. We do not regard this as in any way a genuine or honest undertaking. It is totally lacking in good faith or bona fides. There is no need to create new institutions. This is a national weakness. What we need to do is to make the optimal use of existing institutions in accordance with the law and in the interest of the people of our country. But is that happening at all? Precisely the opposite of that is happening. The standing orders of the Sri Lankan Parliament require that the chairmanship of the Public Finance Committee must go to a member of the opposition. A member of the opposition must preside over the Public Finance Committee. The rationale is very clear. There's a good reason for that. The whole idea is to prevent robbery, plunder. Now, how can you prevent robbery and plunder if the chairmanship of the Public Finance Committee is in the hands of a government member? He will simply act according to the dictates of the government. So, in that situation, there would be no supervision, no control whatsoever. It's not a watchdog function at all. But the appalling reality today is that week after week, government is making acting appointments, temporary, and appointing a government member to chair the Public Finance Committee. By doing so, they are nullifying and frustrating the objectives of that committee. So while doing that on the one hand, and cynically defying the standing orders of Parliament, to talk of creating a new institution makes no sense whatsoever. Now, corruption is by no means a thing of the past. It is very much in evidence at present. The best proof of it is the Express Pearl ship disaster. Massive fraud, obviously. And that is why we are demanding the appointment of a parliamentary select committee to probe all dimensions of this and to ferret out the truth. Fairy stories about the deposit of 250 million US dollars in a British bank, that is the equivalent of the entire health budget of this country, 80 billion rupees, 80,000 million. Does anybody in their senses believe that a British bank, which is very much controlled by the anti-money laundering laws, is going to accept a deposit of 80,000 million rupees, the equivalent of that in dollars, from an individual? Is this believable? Can this happen? So there is this smoke screen. Now, what is being concealed? We need to know that. The only way to know that is the appointment of a parliamentary select committee with full power to call for documents, to examine witnesses, to find out why there has been inordinate delay in instituting legal proceedings in a matter of this degree of importance, which will give us access to a quantum of resources in foreign exchange more than twice what we will get from the International Monetary Fund, and we will get it not as a loan but as an absolute entitlement. So when all that is the case, how do we explain the extraordinary, the absolutely bizarre sequence of events which we are seeing with regard to the lethargy, the indifference, the inertia governing the government's handling of this whole matter. So corruption is at a height. And it will simply not do for the International Monetary Fund to keep talking about it and exhorting the government of Sri Lanka to take meaningful steps. Since they are placing these resources at our disposal, they have an independent and inalienable obligation to put in place practical measures to prevent colossal fraud in this country. We understand that a delegation from the International Monetary Fund is visiting this country within the next 2 weeks, and it is our intention to make a plea to them. Please step in, do something about this level of corruption, and ensure, if you can't eliminate it, then ensure that something constructive is done significantly to diminish its scale.